disruptions efforts. She spent the last 3 years at Facebook as an investigator and analyst, identifying, tracking, and disrupting coordinated I/O campaigns with a particular emphasis on Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. Mona El-Swah is a researcher at the Computational Propaganda Project within the Oxford Internet Institute. She focuses her studies on political communication, social media, and digital copyrights. James Shires is an assistant professor at the Institute for Security and Global Affairs, Leiden University. He's also an associate fellow with the Hague Program for Cyber Norms and a non-resident research fellow with the Cyber Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, Harvard Kennedy School. Although this is a virtual meeting, I will be taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all see on your screens. For those of you calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question on Twitter with hashtag MEICyber or via email at events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please also email events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking at all of your questions and will factor as many as possible into the discussion. And now, without further ado, let's start things off with James. So James, given that you've been surveying the Middle East cyber landscape for a while, how and why have regional governments sought to shape the information environment in the digital age to their own advantage?
Great question, and thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for being here and for everyone watching. Really excited to be on this fantastic panel and such an important topic. So although we're going to be talking a lot about public diplomacy and influence campaigns, which are very much state-based, state-enacted operations and efforts, I'm going to start just by placing that in the broader context of the internet environment and the types of things that that enables, encourages, and disadvantages. So to start with, we have to remember that influence campaigns, especially those conducted by governments in the Middle East, take place within a broader internet architecture that is very much open to manipulation, right? And this internet architecture is not only available for political manipulation, but is designed to enable manipulation for advertising, right? To enable companies to in a very targeted way, collect data and serve adverts towards whatever audiences, whatever populations they choose, right? This is an entirely legitimate form of manipulation, but it is something that underpins the internet architecture more generally, and something that can be used or taken on board by governments to conduct influence campaigns. There's also a high level of artificiality around the internet environment, and especially social media platforms. And this, again, is economically originally encouraged by those platforms, or at least not tamped down on by those platforms, although we are now seeing a lot of legislative and lobbying pressure against that level of artificiality and bots on those platforms. So to really work out what's going on in the Middle East around influence campaigns and public diplomacy, I want to put it into three very simple terms. First, the internet and social media enable greater visibility. This is for governments into the views and opinions of their own populations, but also worldwide into areas that often are very difficult to understand or even get access to. For example, ongoing conflicts in Syria and Libya are highly mediatized, right? They are all over the world, and you get both observers and actors getting involved in these conflicts from all around the world, right? These things are very visible, and governments seem to understand much more about their populations, their views and preferences than they did previously. However, with that visibility comes doubt about whether what you're seeing is really what you're meant to be seeing, or whether it's been designed to project a certain view to a particular audience, right? And this doubt is really encapsulated most in the idea of disinformation. According to the EU, verifiably false information that is disseminated, especially over social media and internet platforms. And finally, once you have visibility and doubt, you have complexity. And this complexity about the effects of information operations, about the unpredictability of their results, means that governments will try many different avenues to get their view across, to message and influence particular audiences, but they'll never be sure whether they'll succeed. I'll leave it there for now and hand back to Andrew.
Thank you so much, James. Moving over to Mona, just as someone who studied a number of efforts to manipulate social media content online, can you walk us through an example of how one of these operations distorts online speech?
Thank you for having me today. Of course, there are a number of operations that have been conducted from the Middle East and to the Middle East. But of course, there is no like a manual script for how to do a disinformation campaign. We wish we know something like this. It would have made my life much easier. But of course, we can also say that from one country to another, there are variations on how to conduct disinformation, how they prefer to conduct disinformation. And also, it evolved over the years. Comparing from 2016 to 2020, we have seen a lot of mutation over the years. But let me give you an example of how disinformation campaign could actually happen. In 2018, we had Twitter publishing disinformation campaign coming from Iran targeting Arabic-speaking users on Twitter. And this campaign was something I was really interested in to study because it was one of the very first data that we have on the region. And I looked at the Arabic data that Iran published, basically. And when you look at their campaign, you can divide it into like 3 stages. The first stage, which was depending on creating false or fake websites, news websites that are very good looking in Arabic. I would not have figured out that they are related to any Iranian operation myself. And when you create a network of websites, the second stage that you need is to create multi-platform accounts. And you can do this by creating fake Twitter accounts, create fake Facebook pages, fake accounts on Facebook, on Instagram, Telegram, WhatsApp, create as much accounts on platforms as possible. And then the third stage, which is like disseminating these websites that you create in the first stage on using these accounts that you create in the second stage. How successful this has been debated, because when you look at the Iranian disinformation campaign that targeted specifically Saudi Arabia on Twitter, at this point, it was not as very successful as people could imagine, because they were not using creative engagement techniques, which is they depended mainly on spreading news, spamming hashtags, but not on engaging audiences, unlike, for example, what we see coming from Russia. So they impersonated news outlets more than Arabic users on Twitter, which other disinformation campaigns have depended on. And we have seen disinformation campaigns impersonating journalists very creatively, like creating these fake accounts of journalists who speak English and talking to the international community. So again, let's remember that we don't have one technique, but they keep it changing. And unfortunately, we are so slow in the way we understand them. They are so fast. The bad actors know how to do the business. And unfortunately, we have many obstacles, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, or maybe if you could just mention briefly, what are some of the main obstacles that researchers face in trying to analyze these kinds of influence operations?
There are so many, actually. So let's start with the fact-checking tools that we have in the region. We are having so limited techniques and tools and institutions that are keen to do fact-checking. I can actually like name them, maybe like 10, maybe at most, that are covering the entire MENA region. If you look at maybe even Facebook and how they do partnership with fact checkers in the region, you only have 2 institutions, Fatabayano and AFP. That's it, period. In comparison with something like in the US, where they have like partnership, I think was maybe 17 organizations. So this gives you like some sort of hint of how less effort that we are having than comparing to something like in the US. And also, so this is the first problem, which is the lacking fact-checking techniques. The second problem would be like we get less data than comparing to something like in the US again. Researchers here, platforms give them less data. We can see examples from, for example, from Tunisian elections, where civil society wanted to monitor the elections. They couldn't do it properly because they had less access to data compared to something like in the US again. Less access to CrowdTangle, less access to the ad library on Facebook. So we know less. And the third thing is that there are less researchers doing this in the region for so many reasons. One of them may be censorship, maybe also lack of resources, lack of fund. So these 3 elements are the main obstacles. However, of course, there are other geopolitical obstacles, but the most important one for me would be like accessing data. If you don't have data, you cannot understand what's happening on the platform.
Thank you so much. Now, Olga, given the considerable amount of online activity you've analyzed in the course of your work at Facebook, what are some key distinctions we should be making in terms of categorizing, analyzing, and understanding online manipulation?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for the question. I'm sort of wearing two different hats today in a way. I'm kind of the academic nerdy professor, but also the practitioner at Facebook. And so you'll know the difference when I get a little bit pedantic about linguistic distinctions. I also think that there's several different frameworks that we can use to think about these problems. And they've been particularly useful both in academic work, but also in practitioner work. And one of the big ones that was one of my pet peeves is the misinformation, disinformation distinction. And I think that's something that's important to call out. The main distinction there being intent. Now, motivation, intent is not always easy to divine. Sometimes you can't tell if there's some sort of intentionality behind particular activity as you're investigating it. On top of that, activity can be financially motivated or politically motivated. It can be on behalf of foreign actors or domestic actors, government actors or non-state actors. And so there's a number of different distinctions and areas that sort of help in the analysis of these types of operations. And that's one of the reasons why, because the complications around those types of terms, that the term that many of us in this space use, but also at Facebook, is influence operations, because they fall into the broader category of what an influence campaign is. And as this panel title hints, there's also this idea of a difference between overt and covert influence. A lot of the things that Mona's talking about, that we've been talking about here, sort of fall into the covert, inauthentic, deceptive category. But then there's a lot of areas in which state actors will engage in overt influence, where they will show their hand, show who is behind the activity. Sometimes that's through state-controlled media outlets or just through overt engagement by politicians. And so making those distinctions between the sort of inauthentic and covert activity and the overt activity also is pretty important. That's why also this panel's title has the word public diplomacy in it. But one thing that we found across a number of the disruptions and operations that we've identified is that false information is not always leveraged at the core of these operations. As Mona described, sometimes it's the false personas or the impersonating news organizations that are at the core of this type of activity. So using terms like disinformation, while popular and important, can sort of muddy the waters, because we have to be clear about what it is that we're talking about. And in that regard, I think one really useful framework to use is something that was coined by Camille Francois at Graphica. It's the actor content behavior framework, or actor behavior content, if you want to go in alphabetical order, ABC. And she's someone who's written extensively about these types of operations. And I think it's a really useful distinction. The actor piece being who is behind the activity. Behavior, we have policies at Facebook around inauthentic behavior, like coordinated inauthentic behavior policies. And a lot of that's important because it's focused on sort of the tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTPs, of the actors that are engaging in this activity, rather than who they are. It doesn't matter whether you're a domestic actor, a foreign actor, financially motivated actor, politically motivated. If you're engaging in coordinated and inauthentic behavior, you can still be sort of liable under this policy. And then the last piece is the content piece. And I know that there was a panel earlier on some content moderation as well. And I think that distinction is particularly important as well. As I said, some of the operations that we've disrupted weren't necessarily leveraging false information. And so when actors engage in false information, in disseminating false information, that can be removed or enforced against under a different lever. And I think it's important not to use, a hammer for every single problem, because then all of them become nails, right? Sort of that commonly used cliched phrase. The way, platforms like Facebook, and I can speak only really for Facebook, identify and disrupt this type of activity is through looking at these types of behaviors, trying to identify what is a coordinated network. Is there sort of a core piece of inauthentic accounts there? And then the cool thing that can happen is, in addition to actually disrupting the networks and taking them down, you can continue to track the same type of actors to see what they're doing. That can feed detection at scale of more types of inauthentic activity in the region, inform product design, because if someone's taking advantage of the same kind of vulnerabilities over and over again, then that can actually inform future work. One last thing that I'll say is, in terms of trends that we've seen in investigating in the Middle East, North Africa, and Gulf region, is, we've disrupted networks from Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Israel, Tunisia, Egypt, Iraq, just to name a few. And the sort of three trends I'll call out are influence for hire, is something that we've seen quite a bit. Firms that are engaged in this type of activity, domestic targeting, and sort of regional specific targeting. And then, as Mona mentioned, this masquerading as local news organizations.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Turning now to Aliyah, given that the United States is both home to most of the world's leading social media firms, yet also a close security partner to many governments in the Middle East and North Africa, including many that have been accused of online influence operations, what policy interventions from the United States might realistically try to curb some of this activity?
I would say I'm really glad that there's increasing attention on these campaigns by US partners, because there's a confluence of interests, and all of these actors that are conducting these online influence campaigns benefit from the same sort of behavior. So I do think that the US should perceive the threat the same way, whether it's a foreign actor like Russia intervening in the Middle East, or whether it's a US partner like Saudi. And I think it's important to set those standards in an even-handed way and treat those actors in the same way when we're dealing with this. So we, as a few of the other panelists mentioned, we need to label those influence campaigns. And I actually checked just before this panel for some of the local media outlets, and there's very inconsistent labeling on platforms like Facebook. So they might label platforms like Iran and fact check them, but they don't necessarily do that if it's a Saudi outlet or a Qatari outlet that is also promoting not necessarily true facts. So we need to work on that. There's some efforts to increase, I believe, Facebook and other social media platforms labeling resources in the Middle East in the same way that they would in the United States, but there's not nearly enough resources or attention dedicated to that. We're not holding them to the same standard that we would in the US, which frankly is still not high enough even for our own interests. At the very least, I'm really troubled by US partners targeting US organizations, especially human rights organizations, who are countering their interests. We've seen a lot of online campaigns directed at organizations like Amnesty International. I think that should be a red line. You should not be able, as a US partner, to target US human rights organizations, let alone, let's not talk about journalists, of course, but you should not be able to target US persons in that way and without a response from the US. So I think that we do need to direct a lot of diplomatic and economic resources towards enforcing those standards evenly across the region, whether it's US partners like Saudi Arabia or again, like Russia. But at the same time, we should not encourage some of our partners to lean into their worst tendencies, which is to enact expansive fake news laws and then use them to enforce their own interests against local journalists or political parties that are opposing their activity. So it's really troubling that they use laws like that as a way to indicate that they're tackling fake news while they're simultaneously spreading disinformation and influence campaigns on social media. So I think that answers your question. I'm happy to answer more in the Q&A.
Yeah, wonderful. We've had a couple of questions coming from the Q&A, so just to get the ball rolling further in discussion, maybe starting off with one question, sort of building off a question we have from Whale in the Q&A for both Mona and Aliyah. And the Whale's asking a bit about, given the challenges that the media environment in the Arabic-speaking world is facing in general, what are some of the best approaches that either government policy or citizen activism might take in order to encourage more sort of free discourse online, or efforts to combat some of the misinformation that we've seen? I mean, maybe Mona, if you could start.
Sure. Yeah. So the problem in the region is that we have less free media or less impartial media, I would say. And there are so many reasons for that. I don't think we have the time or energy for this. Like I always give the example that we have a lot of RTs in the region and we have less of a CNN version. If this can make the comparison much easier. To do so, we need more support for the alternative media. We need more citizen journalists and free blogs to do so. And having said that, we also need to hold these other version accountable, and to do so, you need to maybe downgrade them in the newsfeed and develop your algorithms to counter that. And that has been done maybe in the US version, but not in the Arabic speaking world. And this is why we need more algorithm development in this region.
So I would echo everything that Mona said. I mentioned in conversations with Andrew before this panel that I really have limited faith and optimism in our ability to disrupt all disinformation in the region. I really think the problem stems more largely from the lack of a healthy media environment. And the US has tried many times to provide US facing outlets to sort of counter and reshape the narrative. Unfortunately, those have not been very effective. If anything, they've been counterproductive. Outlets like Al-Hurra might be popular in small pockets of the Middle East, but they're correctly, as our questioner alluded to, they're not taken seriously as a credible and independent source. They're still viewed as a voice for the United States. So those things have not been especially effective either. What I think has been effective are international outlets like CNN and BBC. The Arabic material that they do supply is received much better than any US funded outlet. I would encourage the US to work with those outlets any way that they can and encourage them to stream more broadly on satellite services rather than trying to produce our own content to compete with those. I think, sorry, actually that's it.
Oops, sorry, need to unmute myself. Thank you so much. And thinking a bit more about some of the constraints that governments and firms, individuals might face in addressing some of this misinformation. I'd like to turn to sort of James and Olga and drawing on another one of our questions from the audience. Sort of what are some of the legal and practical limitations on either governments or firms taking action against these influence operations or disinformation networks? And sort of both in a either legal or moral sense, who has the responsibility for taking down these networks? Maybe we can start with James and then move to Olga.
Sure. I might leave the responsibility question to Olga for the taking down, given all the influence campaigns. I'd want to emphasize what Alia was saying about the difficulties with coming up with good regulation on these types of influence campaigns and implementing it appropriately. On one hand, you have the difficulties in defining the problem in the first place, and as we saw with questions of disinformation, misinformation, influence campaigns, and as one of the questioners asked, is this something to do with information operations in a more military way instead? So you have a problem of coming up with adequate regulation in the first place. On the other hand, you also have the problem of co-option of this regulation, of these laws, in order to crack down on political speech that rightly should be available in all societies. So finding that thread between both co-option and overuse and overly broad use of regulation, especially for governments, and on the other hand, actually coming up with adequate regulation in the first place is really difficult. But it's not the first time we've been here, right? This is a problem that we've seen elsewhere in many cases, especially in legal and regulatory spheres in the Middle East and the Arab world, for example, in counterterrorism, again, in terms of cybercrime as well, right? These are all important concepts. They're highly mobilized concepts for regulatory policy and security interventions, but they're also overused and they overstep their boundaries very frequently. So finding that middle line is very difficult, and that's a real constraint for both the governments in the region and those seeking to work with them outside of the region as well.
Yeah, and I can sort of go off of that and take the second question in terms of responsibility. I think from a very practical perspective, and if you're the platform on which someone is operating, you're kind of the only one that can actually disrupt that network, right? That said, there's a lot of amazing research that happens internally and external to the different platforms. There are trust and safety teams and investigative teams at Google, at Facebook, at Twitter, and also a number of other companies, smaller technology companies as well. And they do an amazing job of, conducting these types of investigations, learning about all these tactics, techniques, and procedures, and then trying to share them with one another. But there's also fantastic researchers like Mona and others that are outside of these platforms that can tip off to the identification of these types of networks, can find leads that investigators internally cannot, and also provide another context, global context, and linguistic understanding of these types of networks. And so in terms of the identification piece, I think it's kind of a whole of society approach. But there are roles for everybody to play here, right? James spoke about regulation, but there's also, literacy work that can be done on the ground in different countries around the world. And then there's also government work that can happen in terms of other, other ways of deterring and mitigating this type of activity, right? If one nation state is using, an influence campaign against another, then those governments can take particular actions. Of course, to James' point, it's important to keep in mind, that there are differing incentives for all of these types of organizations, right? Governments as well. And thinking about, I think on the last panel, someone mentioned government requests for removal. Those are something that platforms have to decide whether to comply with or not. And governments can sometimes have malicious incentives to make those requests as well.
Thanks so much. Mona, thinking a little bit on drawing on another question here from Charles. What are some actors in the Middle East and North Africa who've talked a little bit about effectiveness? Which actors have you seen have been quite effective, or at least somewhat effective in combining these more covert influence operations with overt messaging campaigns, state-run media, or so on? And then just to follow up with that with another question for James, sort of what have been to what extent have governments, especially in a region in which, looking around the Gulf, where you have sort of autocratic governments almost every which way you turn, what are some of the limitations on the ability to use influence operations against other countries where information environments that domestically are already so constrained?
Yeah, it's a very good question. To measure the efficiency of disinformation campaign online, you need to measure how the reach of this campaign to users, and also we can know this part, but we cannot know how much they alter the public opinion or actually made an influence. And this is part us as researchers are very having a lot of methodological challenges in order to understand. So I cannot say specifically what a name a specific country, oh, this is the best kind of disinformation campaign in the world. But let me tell you interesting example that I really liked, and it's an evil example, but it's really impressive in the way they did. In last year, and as far as I remember, the Israeli-based campaign, let's put it this way, targeted Tunisia. And one of the creative tools they used is that they created a Facebook fake page that considered itself as a fact-checking Facebook page to help Tunisian discern what is right and what's wrong on news spreading online. And so they used the impersonated fact checker in order to spread this information in a very creative way, differently. So that's something that we haven't seen in maybe in the 2016, 2017, 2018, that this fact checking, impersonating is a whole new level for us. And that's something. Also, we have seen now new trend where governments, they make deals with PR companies in order to spread disinformation campaigns across different platforms. That's something that we also have been seeing in the last maybe 2 years in the Middle East, and also not just in the Middle East, across the world. So that's also a new trend. I don't know in the next year what we're going to see, but we are going to the deep fake era, and this is something that we are going to have a lot of challenges when we study. Having said that, it's really difficult to specifically say, okay, this is influential, this is not. We do our best in measuring this, but I don't think we can certainly say who is successful or not.
Thank you.
And in terms of the constraints on governments, especially in the Gulf, it's important to highlight a few things. Firstly, that these influence campaigns, especially across borders, are sort of volatile politically. They're often very aggressive. But in terms of the broader sort of conflict scenarios in the Middle East and situations, it is relatively tame, right? And these actors are acting under significant constraints. They know what lines they try and cross, they can't really cross, and they push up to those lines, right? So there are significant constraints on these actors. How do they get around it? How do the Gulf governments get around it? Well, in a few ways. One is to look at a broader range of tools to see influence operations and influence campaigns only as one thing in their arsenal. They can also reach for others. For example, they can go for more traditional forms of influence, lobbying, talking individually outside social media to key individuals, maybe having individuals in key social media companies, right? There's a court case going on in the US about access from a Saudi Arabian individual into Twitter. And they could also go the other way, right? And use much more covert cyber techniques, so not TTPs in the sense that Olga using them, but more intrusion campaigns, seeking to hack into their adversaries, as well as using this coordinated social media messaging as well. Another thing they can do is not to target their adversary directly. So for example, in the Gulf crisis between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the predominant actors, although there are others involved, you do see both sides looking outside, looking to the US, looking to other partners to try and influence them rather than influencing the direct opposition. Right? And this happens repeatedly. There's a number of cases of the Gulf states using both hacks, leaks, influence operations in US politics to try and sway individuals from one side to the other. And finally, you see this happening more broadly in a commercial environment when this competition moves onto the economic sphere. And here, the case of football, probably soccer for you guys, is really important, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. It's very important for the Gulf states, especially for Qatar and the World Cup. And you see commercial rights being to television, to sporting events, being the subject of significant disinformation campaigns, hacking campaigns, and so much more. So they can move the playing field, to take the same metaphor, from the direct adversary between the governments to either influential actors outside or a broader commercial environment.
Wonderful, thanks so much. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A sort of about a potential role for civil society actors, whether in the region or even here in the United States, for those of you who are in the United States. Aaliyah, would you be able to talk a little bit to what non-governmental approaches might be, or sort of the intersection between U.S. government policy and civil society organizations? And then following up on that, Olga, would you be able to speak a little bit to are there any potential points of contact between civil society organizations or independent researchers looking at this kind of work and policy teams within social media firms, whether it be Facebook or otherwise? Thank you.
So civil society has a hugely important role to play. Unfortunately, on the ground in the Middle East, they're up against barriers of censorship and of limits on their funding and limits of their interaction with countries like the United States. So it does make it very difficult for the United States to directly work with civil society, whether it's on disinformation or human rights issues. We have to be very, very careful in how we do that in order to not delegitimize their own organic efforts to target disinformation. So we can do things like training relevant civil society organizations, amplifying their message and making it more visible online to prevent them from being censored or targeted by local governments. And there's a big role for US organizations to play as well. I mean, some of the best public analysis of this issue and work in recent years has been totally independent private sector and civil society organizations and think tanks that are not being driven by the US government. They're just coming up organically and doing some of the most important work in this field. So I do think we should try to encourage local civil society organizations to get stronger, and we should lean on our partners, especially in the Middle East, and prevent them from silencing those organizations or limiting their funding. But there really is a big limit to how the US can interact with them in a way that's constructive.
Yeah, and in terms of civil society engaging with platforms, it's been, a pretty fantastic resource over the last few years. As someone who was an investigator, but is also a policy person now, I've engaged quite a bit with researchers when I was focusing on investigating Russian campaigns, for example. Quite a few researchers that exist in the disinformation space were extremely useful, having a back and forth, as an investigator with a researcher to be able to share findings and exchange ideas. On the policy side, we engage with external civil society actors quite a bit. And then also whenever we take down networks of coordinated and authentic behavior, we have been working with an expanding group of researchers to share the findings of our investigation before we take it down, so that independent researchers can write a report ahead of that disruption. So on a monthly basis now, we've been announcing all of the networks that we've taken down for coordinated and authentic behavior. And there have been independent analysis and reports that have come out from the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, from the Stanford Internet Observatory, from Graphica, and from other organizations that are doing that kind of research. And we're continuing to identify more organizations to work with to sort of be able to, within the constraints of sort of privacy concerns and all of those things, share ahead of our takedowns, disruptions, what we've been able to find, and then have someone, take a look at what we found and conduct their own independent analysis of it. And it's been hugely valuable because it provides a different perspective. It shows sort of the more open source investigation, and also goes beyond one platform, kind of looks at these networks as they cut across a number of different platforms. The other thing I'll say, which sort of addresses another question on the Q&A, is about public diplomacy and the distinctions between that and these sort of illegitimate networks. And that's another area that, we've worked quite a bit with external experts on media capture, and talking, last week on Thursday, we announced, as Facebook and other platforms have done similar actions, an effort to label state-controlled media outlets. As I mentioned before, you don't want to use the same hammer for all sorts of problems within that actor behavior content framework. This is an actor-based enforcement, and so it provides more transparency to people about where they're getting their information from, if it is coming from a state-controlled outlet, and so that they can see that. And that's something that we engaged with over 65 media capture experts from around the world, including many from the Middle East and North Africa as well. And so that's another way to engage with civil society.
Wonderful, thank you. Sort of a joint question for Mona and James, again, drawing from the Q&A. To what extent do we see the most of these influence operations on social media websites? I know that the biggest problem in any kind of cyber operation is attribution, but to what extent have these been sort of plausibly linked back to state actors? And so the broad narrative of the past few years has been sort of state-led influence operations in the Middle East and North Africa. But have we also seen considerable activity from sort of non-state actors, be it private firms, sort of political factions or political parties within countries? Just to the extent that you could talk about that would be helpful. So first Mona, James, and yep.
Yeah, we are seeing it more and more than usual, but let's get back to what we have been discussing it, which is like similar operations, a covert and overt kind of thing. Like we have been having like channels that are doing becoming the mouthpieces of their government since forever, since maybe with the inception of satellite in the region. But this has changed over the years and becoming the covert kind of operations. And because it's even cheaper and anyone can do it, it doesn't require much labor than something like the overt one. So we can see more of this, and it's getting more professional over the years. I also want to highlight something that maybe I haven't talked about, and maybe none of us have talked about, which is a kind of patriot trolls that do exist, and specifically in the region where there's a lot of political tension, where they also spread the kind of, they amplify the disinformation, they defend their countries, even using disinformation like the state pact. When I analyze Iran, and also I want to highlight that Iran is not the only one in the region that does this, a lot of countries that do that. When I analyzed Iran, when I saw the website, there wasn't just one website, there were plenty of websites that are falsely registered. I could not trace back to who is behind these. And it took me out of without Twitter telling me that this is Iranian-backed operation, I wouldn't have made the link. But there are a lot of things that are happening, and it's really difficult to say, okay, like there are maybe like 10% of the websites online are fake. I cannot say such a thing, but I can tell you that there are a lot of things that are fake that's going on social media and on the online sphere in general. And our role as researchers try to do so, to highlight things for users, but also we have to train users to fact check on a daily basis because the number of things are going to increase over time and we cannot stop it, but we need to train people to learn how to discern what's really true, what's fake. I hope this answered the question somehow, but I will leave it to James. Hopefully he will back me up.
Thanks, Mona, that's great. I'll just add a couple of other things. First, to say that folks, putting aside the patriotic trolls, the sort of mass public mobilization of public opinion in favor often of regime or government elites or certain avenues of opinion, putting that aside and focusing purely on the market and these sort of influence for hire companies that Olga mentioned right at the start that we've now returned to. I'm really glad we've returned to it. I want to point out the way they vary within this market in two ways. One, we can see by analogy to the broader market for hacking, where there's everything from the base sort of cyber criminal hacking, very easy, not very expensive stuff to do, to the $1 million, you know, it will get right into this specific phone using a technique that no one else knows about at the time and costs a lot of money and is only available to governments, right? And that difference in the market also exists not only for hacking as a service, but also for influence as a service. So you have big public relations firms, right? Old, long-standing ones in the US and in London, where they are offering their services saying, we will get involved in public relations, you know, using both legitimate and maybe grayer forms of influence. But on the other hand, you have the more sort of startup type firms based in the region, but also around the world as well. A lot of the ones that we see in the Gulf are based in India, where there's a lot of outsourcing of IT more generally, but also this PR and dark PR type stuff going on as well. The other way we can separate the market is in terms of activity rather than actor. So there's a lot of activity in terms of dissemination of this material, right? In terms of doing the data analytics. What audience do you want to reach? How do you reach those audiences? How do you segment those audiences? And then it's also in the content production. Some firms get involved in everything. They start with the content, then they try and measure how effective it has been. Some firms only do a little bit of it. So we can also segment the market for influence for hire along this idea of production and dissemination as well.
If I could chime in really quickly on the attribution question, because I think it's a really good one. You know, I think one of the things that I found really challenging working in the sort of influence operations space is that people are quick to attribute. And I think, you know, James has spoken a little bit about, you know, the overlap and intersection with the world of information security. And a lot of people that are investigators in this space tend to come from that background. And the interesting thing there is when there's a hacking campaign, one of the ways to attribute or to try to attribute is based on sort of the geopolitical desires of the actor in question. That's a lot harder to do in a space that is all about political speech, because then you get into this area where you have legitimate political speech and people engaging on topics that they care about, political trolling, as Mona mentioned. And so it gets a lot harder to attribute just based on that. You have to think about things like location, but that can also be spoofed, and that can also be, you know, sort of when it's for hire, it can come from a number of different places. And so attribution becomes a really challenging question, but it's also extremely important to be very explicit about, if to the extent that you're confident about attribution or not, because in the influence space, if you misattribute, it can cause a lot more harm than good if you don't know who's actually behind a network.
Thank you. Just sort of a broad question on recent developments for Aliyah and Mona. For Aliyah, what sort of developments have we seen in U.S. policy towards this, or sort of U.S. policymakers that you've engaged with this? Like, to what degree is there like a you know, more fine-grained understanding of what these influence operations look like, particularly regions of the world that, you know, aren't English speaking? And sort of how has U.S. policy towards this changed over time? And then also, Mona, to what extent do we see evolution in terms of the platforms that individuals are using in the Arabic-speaking world. Whether in terms of people, new generations just taking up new platforms that I don't understand at all, like TikTok, or people leaving platforms like Twitter that they feel have just become unusable as a means of expressing themselves due to censorship or due to manipulation, and instead are turning to private forms of communication like WhatsApp.
So as we kind of mentioned in the invite, this area of competition is not at all new to the United States. This competition for influence has been going on for decades in the Middle East. It used to be that it played out much more in TV and radio stations. And now with the advent of the internet, it's shifted a little bit, but those areas do all blend together in the Middle East. I think what's changed in US policy, at least the last time I checked in with some US officials on this, is that we used to try to lean in very hard to countering the narrative with our own tools. So using our own public diplomacy outlets, whether that's the US Embassy Cairo's Twitter feed or Al Hurra network in the Middle East, I think we've shifted more towards disrupting disinformation and specifically disrupting tools like deepfakes and bots and fake accounts across social media. I think there's a recognition that those are much more menacing than the public competition between news outlets and governments that will frankly always take place and I don't think we can really address through any of these tools. So we've moved towards addressing those things. I think that's really important from the US viewpoint because frankly, we were never very good at competing at public diplomacy, nor were we very good at even competing with social media influence campaigns. I think that we should resist any urge to compete on Russia or Iran or Arab countries' own terms in this area. I do not encourage the use of things like sock puppet fake accounts that we've done in the past. One, because they're ethically problematic, and two, because again, we're not good at it. And I think that doing that really gives away a lot of our moral high ground on this issue and our ability to counter it from other countries. So I think we should walk back any programs to use those. We should not get into bots or deep fakes, that might be happening in the US government without clearance, I wouldn't know, but we should resist doing those things. And we should maintain the norms within the US that we don't target our own citizens with disinformation networks, and that we don't target even Arab populations or Middle Eastern populations, because frankly, we do actually have a moral high ground and a better approach than these other countries. And we should do everything possible to maintain those norms in order to be more effective in discouraging this behavior in the Middle East.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will answer your question about people moving from one platform to another, but in maybe two different ways. I will reflect first on where the disinformers go and where people go as well. So for a disinformation campaign to happen, the disinformers or people who are behind these campaigns select the platform in which the manipulation happened the most, depending on the country. So for example, in Brazil and India, we have seen campaigns happening on WhatsApp, but we haven't seen such a trend maybe in the US, because for the best platform for US but disinformation would be like Twitter, because this is where the Americans are. Same thing for Twitter on the Arab world, which is not very common, by the way, in North Africa, but maybe more in the Gulf. So when Iran did this disinformation campaign, they targeted Twitter the most because they were more keen on Saudi Arabia, which it's a country that really uses Twitter. But if they were doing it for other countries in North Africa, that wouldn't have been the platform. Saying this, reflecting on the users, do they actually move because of this information? I would argue against that, because we have been dealing with this information since forever, and the public knowledge has really increased since 2016 specifically about that this information do exist in these platforms. However, people are still using these platforms, and the same maybe way in 2016. So I cannot say that people are really shifting because of the existence of this information. However, people might shift because of censorship, because they cannot say their real opinion, and we can see that for instance from
Sorry,
they knew that book is edited by the government. So they had to move to other organized. So saying this, I cannot, however, say that people move because of the existence of this information. And that's unfortunate, but this is how we deal. But they move because of other reasons, which is safety.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you everyone who's joined us, and thank you to our speakers for an excellent panel, and as well to our international audience for joining us. We need to end promptly in order to let everyone join the conference's next session, which will examine cyber warfare in the Middle East, and which will begin right at 1:30. You'll find the link to join the next session in your chat boxes, and thank you all again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye.